a small island nation in the North Atlantic would grow to control a quarter of the entire world, governing over 458 million people across 6 continents. For 300 years, the British Empire experienced amazing successes, enormous wealth, and terrible cruelty. Let us explore what life was truly like at the heart of the largest empire in all of human history. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider subscribing. I am always curious to know what time it is where you are. Feel free to comment below. The idea of time zones always remains a fascinating mystery to me. Tonight, we will journey into the story of the British Empire. But first, let us make sure you are completely comfortable. Adjust your pillows. Pull up your blanket. Trust me, once we begin, you will not want to move. Your eyes gently open in the deep darkness. It is still many hours before the sun will rise, and the harsh cold of a 9th century English morning has already found its way beneath your thin woolen blanket. The straw mattress below you makes a soft, crackling sound as you move, trying to find some warmth that simply is not there. Outside, you can hear the wind making a low, mournful sound. It is not just any wind. It is the kind of wind that carries whispers of something far worse, Vikings. The very sound of that word makes your stomach tighten. They have been attacking villages along the coast for many decades now, but their raids are becoming more frequent, more organized, and much more deadly. Just last month, they burned the monastery only 10 miles north of here. No one survived. You are not safe within the thick stone walls of a grand castle. You are in a simple wooden hut with spaces between the wooden planks, wide enough to let in both the freezing air and the alarming sounds of approaching danger. The straw roof above you drips when it rains, which in England seems to happen almost constantly. They are coming. Someone cries out from outside. The Danes are coming. And just like that, your quiet village bursts into a noisy panic. This is the very beginning of what would one day become the largest empire known to humankind. But at this moment, England is not conquering anyone. The people are simply trying to stay alive. The year is 878 AD, and King Alfred, who will later be called Alfred the Great, though no one calls him that yet, is in deep trouble. The Vikings, led by Guthrum, have launched a massive invasion, and Alfred has been forced to retreat to the marshy lands of Somerset. Imagine this scene. The King of Wessex is hiding in a swamp, while Danish warriors take over his kingdom. The king has been defeated, a tired messenger tells your village. We must run away or surrender. But here is where the story becomes truly interesting. Instead of giving up, Alfred does something quite unexpected. In these marshlands, this lonely place of mud and tall reeds, and fog so thick you can barely see your hand in front of your face, he begins to make a secret plan. The marshes of Somerset are not only wet and uncomfortable, they are almost like an entirely different world. When you walk through water that reaches your knees, Every single step feels like it might pull your boots right off. The constant wetness seeps into your clothes, into your skin, and deep into your very bones. At night, the temperature drops so low that your breath creates little clouds in front of your face. Your fingers turn blue with cold. Your teeth chatter so hard you worry they might break. But these marshes also offer a kind of safety. The Vikings do not know these winding waterways. They do not know which paths lead to solid ground and which lead to deep sinkholes that will swallow a person whole. The mud saved us, one of Alfred's soldiers would say much later. Can you truly imagine being saved by mud? Within these marshes, Alfred quietly gathers his loyal followers. These are not professional soldiers. They are farmers, blacksmiths, tanners, and ordinary people who have families they want to protect. They train with any weapons they can find or create. Some have proper swords. Most others have farm tools that they have sharpened. You are among them, learning how to fight with a pitchfork, because it is all you have. Your hands develop painful blisters and even bleed as you practice for many hours, day after day. The heavy weight of the weapon makes your arms ache, but you continue to push forward. What other choice do you have in such desperate times? Then comes the special moment that will change everything. Alfred, this king who has been hiding in the marshes, leads his small, untrained army to a place called Eddington. You march alongside men who are just as frightened as you are, yet just as determined. The battle is pure chaos, loud screaming, the sight of blood, the sharp clash of metal, and the soft squishing sound of mud beneath your feet. Men fall and die all around you. Some suffer wounds so terrible that you know you will see them in your worst nightmares for many years to come. The smell is overwhelming: blood, sweat, fear, and the scent of death itself. But somehow, against all expectations, Alfred wins. The Viking leader, Guthrum, agrees to be baptized as a Christian, and a treaty is signed, creating the Danelaw. This is a region where Viking rule is officially accepted, but the rest of England is now safe. This is how the story of the British Empire truly begins. Not with grand conquests, but with sheer survival. Not with total domination, but with a desperate fight just to exist. Let us move forward about 100 years in time. Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, becomes the first king to bring all of England together under a single ruler. It is the first time that this collection of separate kingdoms, different tribes, and scattered territories has been united as one single nation. One land, one king. The people joyfully proclaim, England. But let me tell you, being united does not mean very much when you are a simple peasant working your tiny plot of land. You still wake up before the sun rises, still toil until your back feels like it might break, and still often go to bed hungry more nights than not. The fields do not care who wears the crown, and England is still very small, truly tiny, compared to what it will eventually become. The very idea of an empire is still many centuries away. In fact, the first real step towards building an empire does not happen until the year 1171, when English King Henry II decides to expand his lands into Ireland. And when I say decides to expand, what I truly mean is that he invades his neighbor. But wait, it becomes even more interesting. Henry II arrives in Ireland with a group of knights and many soldiers, sails into the port of Waterford, and simply declares, "This land is mine now." The Irish kings and chieftains are understandably surprised, saying, "Excuse us, what did you say?" And Henry II's direct response is, "Did I stammer? Submit to my rule or face the consequences." Now, imagine yourself as an Irish farmer at this exact moment. You are just living your peaceful life, tending to your crops, trying to survive on the same land your family has worked for many generations. Then, suddenly, some foreign king appears with armed men and announces that your very home now belongs to him. It is like if your neighbor forcefully kicked down your door, sat down on your sofa, and then calmly declared that your house was now theirs. The only difference is that there are many more swords and no police to call for help. Surprisingly, various Irish bishops and religious leaders meet at a gathering called the Synod of Cashel and actually recognize Henry II as their new ruler. And just like that, Ireland becomes England's very first colony, the first domino to fall in what will eventually become a vast global empire. Now, let us jump forward in time to the year 1277. King Edward I desires Wales. He does not ask politely. He simply brings an army and marches right in. The Welsh people fight back, of course. They understand their mountainous land in ways the English do not. They use clever guerrilla tactics, setting traps and ambushing English soldiers in narrow valleys where the larger English numbers cannot help them. But Edward I is determined and never gives up. When the Welsh resistance is finally defeated, he builds enormous castles all across Wales. These are not built as homes or grand palaces, but purely as symbols of his powerful rule. These are not the gentle fairy tale castles you might be imagining. These are harsh, imposing fortresses designed specifically to frighten and control. Those high walls are not meant to keep invaders out. A Welsh farmer explains quietly to his young son. They are built to keep us locked in. However, England's ambitions are still limited to its closest neighbors. The wider world beyond remains mostly unknown. But that is about to dramatically change. The late 1400s bring about a great shift in how Europeans view the entire world. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sails westward and accidentally discovers the Americas. Suddenly, there are vast new lands to explore, new resources to gather, new peoples to meet, and tragically, new places to conquer. The English government sees a new chance when an Italian explorer named Giovanni Caboto, who changes his name to the more English-sounding John Cabot, approaches King Henry VII with an exciting proposal to explore this newly found continent. The king is very interested. he gives Cabot an official document allowing him to claim any lands he finds for England. In May of 1497, Cabot sets sail from Bristol on a small ship named the Matthew. The journey across the ocean is incredibly harsh. Imagine being on a wooden boat smaller than a modern bus, thrown about by huge Atlantic waves taller than houses. The constant rocking motion makes your stomach feel ill. The salty sea spray soaks your clothes, which never truly dry in the damp air. You sleep on hard wooden planks, if you can sleep at all. Many sailors simply fall overboard during terrible storms, never to be seen again. After weeks of this difficult torture, Cabot and his crew finally spot land. It will later be known as Newfoundland. They meet the native peoples who have lived there for thousands of years, plant the English flag, and claim the territory for England. Because that is what Europeans often did back then. They arrived somewhere people already lived and simply said, "This is ours now." But claiming land and actually being able to control it are two very different things. England's first serious attempt to establish a colony does not come until much later, and it does not go well at all. Let us discuss the story of Roanoke. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I grants Sir Walter Raleigh a special permission to explore and colonize lands in the New World. Raleigh then sends an expedition to Roanoke Island, which is located off the coast of what is now North Carolina. About 100 people arrive there in 1585. They build a fort and try to interact with the local Native American tribes. At first, their relationships are friendly. They exchange goods and share knowledge, but tensions slowly increase over time. The difficult conditions of the region, including widespread disease and shortages of food, make life terribly hard for the colonists. Many become very sick with fevers that leave them confused and burning hot, even as they shiver uncontrollably. Others suffer from dysentery, a horrific illness where your body essentially empties itself through constant, bloody sickness. Food becomes dangerously scarce. The colonists, who are mostly city people from England, do not know how to farm in this new environment. They cannot tell which plants are safe to eat and which are poisonous. They do not know how to hunt the unfamiliar animals. They are starving in a land that has plenty, simply because they lack the necessary knowledge to survive. When Sir Francis Drake stops by on his way back to England, he offers to take the colonists home. Most accept his offer, abandoning the colony. Raleigh tries again in 1587 with 118 new settlers. But when ships return 3 years later, everyone has mysteriously disappeared. The only clue left behind is the word Croatoan carved into a post. The lost colony of Roanoke remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. Did they join with native tribes? Were they killed by attackers? Did they try to sail home and drown at sea? We still do not know for sure. What we do know is that establishing new colonies is incredibly difficult. It is not merely about placing a flag and claiming a piece of land. It is about surviving in strange new environments, confronting diseases your body has no natural protection against, finding food when you cannot recognize the plants or animals, and carefully managing complex relationships with the indigenous peoples who, quite understandably, might not be pleased about strangers arriving and claiming their ancient ancestral lands. Meanwhile, back in Europe, England faces a very different kind of danger. In 1588, Spanish King Philip II sends the Spanish Armada, a massive fleet of 130 ships carrying over 30,000 soldiers, sailors, and marines, to invade England. Queen Elizabeth I bravely calls upon her skilled naval commanders, including Sir Francis Drake, to defend her kingdom. Despite being greatly outnumbered and having fewer, smaller ships, the English have advantages in how easily their ships can move and in their powerful weapons. Imagine yourself on one of those English ships. The wooden deck sways beneath your feet as large waves rock the vessel back and forth. The air smells strongly of salt water, gunpowder, and deep fear. All around you, men are preparing for battle, checking their cannons, sharpening their swords, and offering prayers to whatever gods they believe in. When the Spanish Armada appears on the horizon, it is a truly terrifying sight. Ship after ship after ship, seemingly without end. Your mouth feels dry, your hands tremble. The man standing next to you throws up over the side of the ship, but the English have a clever plan. Using their smaller, more agile ships, they attack the Armada from the back, firing many cannon shots and then quickly retreating. The Spanish, in their much larger, slower vessels, cannot respond effectively. Then comes a moment of brilliant strategy. The English send fire ships, which are vessels filled with flammable materials and set ablaze, directly towards the Armada. The sight of these floating infernos causes the Spanish ships to break their disciplined formation. The Battle of Gravelines then follows. It is a fierce and very long fight where English ships engage the Spanish at a very close distance. The sounds are deafening. The thunder of cannon fire, the splintering of wood, and the screams of men in pain and fear. When the battle is finally over, the Spanish retreat, attempting to sail back to Spain. Terrible storms and strong ocean currents take their toll, and what finally returns to Spain is only a shadow of the mighty Armada that first set out. England has successfully defended itself against one of the most powerful nations in the world, and in doing so, it has shown that despite its small size, it is a force to be seriously respected. However, while England celebrates this great victory at sea, closer to home, Ireland continues to resist English rule. Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, leads a rebellion against the increasingly harsh English policies. O'Neill feels torn between his loyalty to the English crown and his deep love for Ireland and its people. He simply cannot bear to see Ireland suffer under foreign control. He raises his banner, calling upon other Gaelic lords to join him in this resistance. The English respond quickly, sending armies to crush the rebellion. Battle after battle leaves the countryside deeply scarred. This conflict earns the name 9 Years' War, as it continues from 1593 to 1603. For the average Irish person, this war is like living through hell on earth. Your fields are burned by one side or the other, leaving you with absolutely nothing to harvest. Your livestock, the animals you rely on for milk, meat, and labor, are slaughtered or stolen. Your home might be completely destroyed, forcing you to seek shelter in dense forests or hidden caves. You are caught helplessly between two powerful forces, neither of which seems particularly concerned about your survival. In 1601, a small Spanish force arrives to help the Irish rebels, but the Battle of Kinsale ends in a terrible defeat for the combined Irish and Spanish forces. The rebellion collapses, and in 1603, the Irish finally surrender. The Treaty of Mellifont grants pardons to the rebels, allowing them to keep some of their lands and religious freedoms. However, it also leads to the gradual destruction of the Gaelic language and the discouragement of Catholicism in favor of Anglicanism. They want to change us completely, an Irish farmer tells his children with a heavy heart. They do not just want our land, they want us to become just like them. As the 16th century slowly comes to an end, England has firmly established itself as an important European power. It has successfully fought off the Spanish Armada, brought Ireland more firmly under its control, and begun to explore new possibilities in the New World. But the true expansion of what will eventually become the British Empire is only just beginning. The 17th century will bring the very first successful English colonies in North America, the sad development of the slave trade, and the establishment of trading posts in far-off India. It is at this moment that England truly begins to look outward beyond its immediate neighbors and towards a global presence. The strong foundation is now being carefully laid for what will grow to become the largest empire in all of human history. In the year 1606, the Virginia Company of London is created with the aim of finding wealth and a passage to the Pacific Ocean. With the blessing of King James I, 104 settlers depart from the River Thames in London on December 20th, 1606, setting sail for the New World. Try to truly imagine what this journey must have been like for these brave people. They are leaving behind everything they have ever known, their cherished homes, many of their beloved family members, and the familiar sights and sounds and smells of England. They are boarding small wooden ships to cross a vast ocean known for its violent storms and many deadly dangers. And they are heading for a land that most of them have only ever heard about in stories. These stories range from descriptions of a perfect paradise to scary tales of cannibals and fearsome monsters. The winter voyage is incredibly harsh. Great Atlantic storms toss the ships around like small toys. Huge waves crash over the decks, completely soaking everything and everyone on board. Below deck, the air is thick with the terrible smell of vomit, unwashed bodies, and deep fear. Many passengers are terribly seasick for weeks on end. Some even die during the crossing, their bodies gently committed to the deep ocean with short prayers. On May 13th, 1607, the survivors finally arrive on a marshy peninsula in what is now Virginia. They name their new settlement Jamestown in honor of their king. At first, the colonists are amazed by the sheer beauty of this new land. They see lush forests, clear waters, and abundant wildlife. But this paradise quickly transforms into a living hell. The Virginia climate, with its constant heat and thick humidity, is unbearable for many. Disease spreads rapidly among the settlers. Malaria and dysentery tragically claim many lives. You have never experienced heat like this before. It feels as if the very air itself is trying to drown you. Your clothes stick uncomfortably to your skin, completely soaked with sweat from early morning until late evening. Even the act of breathing feels like hard work. Then there is the terrible hunger. The colonists arrive when crops are not yet ready for harvest, and with their supplies quickly diminishing, they face starvation. The land, while beautiful, is entirely unfamiliar. They do not know which plants are safe to eat, which are poisonous, or which might have healing properties. "We came looking for gold," one colonist says with a bitter tone. "We found only death instead." Relationships with the local Powhatan Confederacy are complicated and often tense. Misunderstandings and a deep lack of trust lead to frequent clashes. The settlers struggle to communicate and negotiate effectively. Leadership within the colony also faces many challenges. Power dynamics constantly shift, and direction is often unclear. When the brave leader John Smith departs, the situation becomes even worse. The winter of 1609 becomes famously known as the starving time. Food supplies completely run out. The colonists eat whatever they can find, including horses, pets, leather, and, according to some grim accounts, even the bodies of those who had already died. Of the original settlers, only 60 managed to survive this terrible period. But somehow, against all odds, Jamestown manages to endure. John Rolfe then introduces the cultivation of tobacco, which thrives in the Virginia soil and climate. This brings much needed financial success to the struggling colony, attracting even more settlers. While Jamestown is struggling to establish itself, English merchants are beginning to look eastward. In 1607, William Hawkins is sent to establish trade in India. After a dangerous voyage, he arrives in the port of Surat in 1608, one of the most important trading centers on the Indian west coast. The Mughal Emperor Jahangir warmly welcomes the English visitors. Intrigued by the foreign goods and the promising possibility of trade, negotiations result in an agreement allowing the English East India Company to set up a trading post in Surat. By 1612, the Surat trading post is fully operational, exchanging English weapons and metalware for valuable Indian textiles, spices, and indigo. This marks the beginning of England's presence in India, a presence that will grow dramatically over the next 2 centuries. Back in England, religious tensions are increasing. King James I makes it absolutely clear that everyone must be Anglican. Those who do not follow this rule are told to leave the country. This strong demand gives rise to the idea of America as a place where people can practice their religion freely. In 1620, a group of English religious dissenters, known as the Pilgrims, set sail for the New World aboard the Mayflower. The journey is terrifying. The ship was originally built to transport wine between England and France, not to cross the vast Atlantic Ocean. Storms violently toss the boat. Passengers are crowded below deck in semi-darkness, soaked by water that leaks in from above. Disease spreads quickly in these cramped, unsanitary conditions. In the middle of the ocean, the ship almost becomes completely disabled when a storm severely damages its main beam. By a stroke of incredible luck, one of the colonists possesses a metal jack screw, which he had bought in Holland to help build homes in the new settlement. They use it to secure the damaged beam, keeping the vessel safe for travel. Despite these immense challenges, the Mayflower reaches Cape Cod on November 21st, 1620. The Pilgrims establish Plymouth Colony, but their struggles are far from over. By December, most passengers have become very ill, coughing severely and suffering from scurvy. By March, only 47 of the original colonists have survived. Yet somehow, this tiny settlement manages to endure. As England establishes its first footholds in North America, it also turns its attention to the Caribbean. In 1624, the explorer Thomas Warner establishes the colony of St. Christopher, now known as St. Kitts, in the Caribbean. The following year, French Captain Pierre Belaine Desnambuck joins the English, forming a shared colony. Warner accepts these French newcomers because of his fear of the native Kalinago tribe. When the Kalinago plan to attack the Europeans, an enslaved woman named Barb reveals their secret plan. What happens next is a terrible massacre. The English and French kill between 100 and 120 Kalinago people in their beds, only sparing the most beautiful women to serve as slaves. The very next day, they gather approximately 4,000 Kalinago people and brutally kill them as they try to surrender. The nearby river runs red with blood, quite literally. It becomes known as the Bloody River, flowing past the aptly named Bloody Point. With the Kalinago people mostly eliminated, the European colonists face a new problem: who will perform the difficult and demanding labor of tobacco farming. Their tragic solution is to import enslaved people from Africa. And so begins one of the darkest chapters in the empire's long history. The slave trade will become a fundamental part of British colonial economics, bringing immense wealth to some, while inflicting unimaginable suffering on millions of innocent people. As the 1620s continue, England steadily expands its Caribbean presence, settling Barbados in 1625, Nevis in 1627, and both Montserrat and Antigua in 1632. These islands become critically important to the growing empire, producing valuable crops like sugar and tobacco. But the true foundations of the empire are still being carefully laid. The dramatic expansion that will make Britain the world's dominant power is yet to fully unfold. However, the seeds have now been firmly planted in North America, in the Caribbean, and in India. Over the next several centuries, these seeds will grow into the largest empire the world has ever witnessed. As you rest in your bed tonight, feeling comfortable and safe, take a moment to consider those early colonists. They faced unknown dangers, battled harsh natural elements, and made desperate choices to survive. Think about the indigenous peoples whose lives were forever changed by the arrival of Europeans. Think about the enslaved Africans who were tragically torn from their homes to toil in foreign lands. The story of the British Empire is one of extraordinary human achievement and great courage, but also one of exploitation, deep cruelty, and the destruction of cultures. It is a complex legacy that continues to shape our world even today. And this is truly just the very beginning. The empire will grow far beyond these early small footholds, eventually encompassing nearly a quarter of the Earth's entire land surface and ruling over 458 million people. But that is a story for another time. For now, as your eyes grow heavy and sleep gently begins to claim you, remember that history is not just about kings and queens, grand battles, and formal treaties. It is about ordinary people living through extraordinary times, making choices, some heroic, some horrific, that echo through the centuries. The British Empire did not begin with grand designs of global domination. Instead, it began with survival, with opportunities, and with a gradual expansion that would, over many generations, reshape the world in ways no one could have ever possibly imagined. The year is 1534, and King Henry VIII is about to do something truly astonishing that will change England, and eventually the entire world forever. Imagine waking up one quiet morning to discover that your country now has a completely new religion, simply because the king could not have a son with his wife. Yes, that truly happened. But let us go back a little in time. Henry VIII had been married to Catherine of Aragon for many years. They had a daughter, Mary, but he had no male heir. And Henry VIII was absolutely determined to have a son to inherit his royal throne. The king's moods are darker than a storm cloud, whispers a nervous servant in the royal kitchens. He walks the long halls at night, muttering about sons and who will come after him. Henry VIII decides his marriage is cursed because Catherine was previously married to his older brother Arthur, who tragically died. According to ancient texts, marrying your brother's widow is forbidden. Henry VIII becomes convinced this is the reason he does not have a male heir. So he asks the Pope for an annulment of his marriage. The Pope, who is influenced by Catherine's very powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V of Spain, simply says no. Now, if you or I were told no by the highest religious authority on earth, we would probably just accept it. But kings are not like ordinary people. When Henry VIII is told no, he essentially declares, "Fine, I will create my own church where I am in charge." And that is exactly what he does. In 1534, Parliament passes the Act of Supremacy, officially establishing the Church of England with King Henry VIII as its supreme head. Think about what this meant for ordinary people. Imagine you are a peasant farmer who has been Catholic your entire life, just like every generation of your family for centuries before you. Your complete understanding of the world, of the afterlife, of salvation, everything is deeply rooted in Catholic teachings. Then, suddenly, by royal order, you are told that all of that is wrong. And now, you must follow this new church instead. My grandmother wept for many days, a man later remembered. She believed we would all be lost for leaving our true faith. Some people accepted this change, while others strongly resisted. Those who would not accept the king as the church's leader faced harsh punishments, even death. After Henry VIII's passing, his daughter Mary, a very devoted Catholic, took the throne and tried to bring Catholicism back, earning the name Bloody Mary for her cruel persecution of Protestants. But her time ruling was quite brief. When her half-sister Elizabeth I became queen, she brought back Protestantism as England's official religion, passing her own Act of Supremacy in 1559. Meanwhile, far across the Atlantic Ocean, the urgent race for new colonies had already started. The Spanish had created many colonies across South America. The Portuguese controlled the land of Brazil. The French had settlements in places like Quebec and Florida. Elizabeth I saw all this expansion and thought to herself, I also desire some of that. So, she sent forth a group of skilled sailors to explore the wider world. These men, known as the Sea Dogs, were given official permission to attack and plunder Spanish ships. One of Elizabeth I's first choices was John Hawkins, a killer who had been pardoned and joined the Royal Navy to save his own life. In 1561, Hawkins sailed to the Canary Islands, a Spanish colony located off the coast of Africa. There he uncovered a terrible but very profitable business opportunity, the trading of enslaved people. In 1562, Hawkins sailed to Sierra Leone, where he forcibly captured 300 Africans and made them board his ship. The conditions were far beyond humane. People were chained together, lying amidst their own filth, with hardly enough food or water to stay alive. Many perished during the journey from illness, extreme hunger, or by choosing to end their own lives. Hawkins sold these enslaved people in the Caribbean, exchanging them for pearls, animal hides, and sugar. This business was so very profitable that when he returned to England, he was even made a knight. Pause for a moment and consider that. The very first English slave trader received a knighthood for his terrible achievements. But Queen Elizabeth I was not only interested in attacking Spanish ships and trading enslaved people. She also wanted to establish lasting English settlements in the New World. After the failed Roanoke colony we discussed before, England finally established a truly successful permanent colony at Jamestown in 1607. But the living conditions there were terribly harsh. The water tastes as if someone relieved themselves in it, a colonist wrote home, because someone probably did just that. The Jamestown settlement was built on a marshy piece of land with salty water that made everyone ill. Mosquitoes carried the disease of malaria. Poor hygiene often led to dysentery. Food was very hard to find. Out of the original 104 settlers, only 38 managed to survive the first year. John Smith, one of the colony's leaders, enforced very strict rules to keep the settlement alive, stating clearly, "He who does not work will not eat." This did not make him popular, but it did keep people from dying. The colony's luck changed when John Rolfe introduced a type of tobacco that grew very well in the Virginia soil. Suddenly, Jamestown had a profitable crop to sell. The need for workers increased greatly, and in 1619, the very first ship carrying enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia. Around this same time, another group of English settlers was preparing to sail for America, not seeking gold or tobacco, but rather for religious freedom. The Puritans believed the Church of England had not done enough to remove Catholic influences. They faced hardship under King James I and his son Charles II, who demanded strict following of Anglican ways. In 1620, a group of these religious dissenters, known as the Pilgrims, set sail aboard the Mayflower. After a difficult 66-day journey across the Atlantic, they landed at what would become Plymouth, Massachusetts. Their first winter was truly devastating. Half of the colonists died from the bitter cold, from extreme hunger, and from widespread disease. Imagine huddling together in a simple shelter as the temperature fell far below freezing. The wind found every small opening in the roughly built walls. Your fingers and toes grew completely numb. Your breath created misty clouds in the freezing air. Your stomachs ached with constant hunger. We buried our dead in unmarked graves at night, one survivor later wrote, so the native people would not know how many of us had passed away. But by the time spring arrived, the situation began to get better. The local Wampanoag people, led by their chief Massasoit, taught the survivors how to plant corn, how to catch fish, and how to hunt game. The small colony slowly began to grow. 10 years later, a much larger group of Puritans arrived, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Unlike the Pilgrims, these Puritans did not wish to separate from the Church of England. They wanted to cleanse it, and they believed their new colony would serve as an example for the entire world. "We shall be like a city set upon a hill," declared John Winthrop, their esteemed leader. eyes of all people are upon us. But this city upon a hill was not truly a shining example of tolerance. The Puritans created a society built upon their very strict religious convictions. Anyone who strayed faced harsh punishment or was sent away. The Puritans came to America seeking religious freedom. A later historian remarked, the freedom to practice their own religion and to forbid everyone else from practicing any other. The religious passion was so strong that some, like Roger Williams and Thomas Hooker, left to establish more accepting colonies in Rhode Island and Connecticut. While the Puritans were building their devout society in New England, the English were also expanding their presence into the Caribbean. In 1624, they established a colony on St. Kitts, followed by settlements on Barbados, Nevis, Montserrat, and Antigua. These islands became incredibly profitable because of one main crop, sugar. But growing sugar was terribly hard work, requiring much effort. The labor involved clearing land, planting, weeding, and harvesting in the intense tropical heat. European colonists, not used to the climate and vulnerable to tropical diseases, quickly began to use enslaved African labor. Life for an enslaved person on a Caribbean sugar plantation was like a living hell on earth. You would wake before the sun rose and work until sunset in temperatures that often went above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Your back would bleed from the overseer's whip. Your hands were raw and covered in blisters from cutting sugar cane with a large knife. You were given hardly enough food to stay alive. At night, you would collapse in a simple hut, only to repeat the same painful process the next day, and the day after that, and so on. You do not become accustomed to it, an enslaved man later stated. You simply learn how to endure it. The death rate on sugar plantations was so very high that plantation owners found it cheaper to work people to death and then replace them, rather than trying to keep them healthy. It was one of the cruelest labor systems in all of human history. By the 1640s, Barbados had changed from a fairly mixed society of small farmers to a slave colony controlled by huge plantations. The island became incredibly rich for its white residents. In 1645, there were 5680 enslaved Africans on Barbados. By 1668, that number had grown to over 40,000. Back in England, religious disagreements continued to slowly build. King Charles I's attempts to force Anglican worship onto Scotland sparked a rebellion. His increasingly strict rule and his ignoring of Parliament led to more and more opposition. In 1642, these deep tensions burst into a bitter civil war. On one side were the royalists, who supported the king. On the other side were the parliamentarians, who fought for more power for Parliament. For the ordinary person, the English Civil War was a terrible nightmare. Neighbors fought against neighbors. Families were cruelly torn apart by their divided loyalties. Villages were plundered by both sides. Fields lay empty as men were called to fight instead of farming, causing severe food shortages. I saw a man kill his own brother one witness later told. They wore different colors, served different leaders, but they shared the very same blood. After many years of fighting, the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, finally won. Charles I was captured, tried for treason, and executed in 1649, an event that deeply shocked all of Europe. A king chosen by God himself had been tried and put to death by his own subjects. Cromwell then made himself Lord Protector, essentially a military ruler. He forbid traditional Christmas celebrations, deeming them too Catholic. He enforced very strict moral rules, and he expanded England's empire through military victories. In Ireland, Cromwell's forces carried out terrible acts that are still remembered today. At Drogheda, in 1649, they killed almost 3,500 people after taking the town, including soldiers, ordinary citizens, and priests. At Wexford, they killed 2,000 Irish troops and 1,500 civilians, completely burning the town to ashes. They killed absolutely everyone, a survivor later recalled. Men, women, and children. They showed no kindness. Cromwell then focused on Scotland, defeating the Scottish royalists who supported Charles II, the executed king's son. By 1653, Cromwell controlled England, Scotland, and Ireland, forming the basis of what would later be known as the United Kingdom. Despite his harsh rule at home, Cromwell expanded England's lands across the seas. In 1655, English forces took Jamaica from Spain, adding another valuable sugar island to the growing empire. After Cromwell's death in 1658, the monarchy was brought back with Charles II as king. Charles II continued the empire's expansion, setting up the Royal African Company to control all gold and slave trades in Africa. He also granted permission for Carolina, named after himself, creating a protective zone between the English colonies and Spanish Florida. In 1664, English forces captured New Amsterdam from the Dutch, changing its name to New York. By the end of the 17th century, England controlled many colonies along the eastern coast of North America, stretching from New Hampshire to Carolina. The Caribbean islands of Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands brought huge wealth through the production of sugar. And the East India Company had established trading outposts at Bombay, Madras, and Kolkata. The strong foundation of the British Empire was now firmly in place. England had transformed from a relatively small European power to a very significant colonial force. Its navy now ruled the seas. Its merchants traded across the entire world. Its plantations produced many valuable goods. All of this growth brought enormous wealth to England, but it came with a terrible cost to human lives. Millions of native people were forced from their homes or tragically killed. Millions of Africans were enslaved and carried across the Atlantic Ocean in conditions so dreadful that many did not survive the voyage. And for the ordinary English person, life was not much better than it had been before the empire started to grow. plantation owners and to the wealthy aristocracy. The working class continued to struggle with deep poverty, with widespread disease, and with very harsh living conditions. As night gently falls, and you slowly drift towards sleep, think about the strange contradictions of an empire, the incredible human achievements existing alongside unimaginable cruelty, the creation of great wealth existing alongside deep exploitation, and the spread of certain ideals existing alongside the suppression of others. The story of the British Empire is not a simple tale of heroes and villains, but rather a complex weaving of human ambition, courage, greed, and suffering. And we are still only at the beginning of this story. In the next century, Britain would face new challengers, fight major global wars, and expand its empire to a size never before seen. But for now, please rest. Let the gentle weight of history settle around you like a soft blanket, heavy with the quiet lessons of the past. By the 1670s, the New England colonies were growing at a speed that would cause modern city planners to feel a great sense of panic. In just 50 years, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had burst from 180 people to over 64,000. That was not a slow, gentle increase. That was an explosion of people. And what happens when you have many more people? You need much more space, more resources, and more food. So, the colonists began moving outward beyond their first settlements. There was just one small problem. They were expanding into land that already belonged to someone else, the Wampanoag Confederacy. Now, let us be completely honest. The relationship between the Wampanoag people and the colonists was complicated from the very beginning. The Wampanoag initially helped the struggling Plymouth settlers to survive, teaching them how to grow corn and how to find their way in the unfamiliar landscape. But as more ships kept arriving, bringing more colonists who needed more land, tensions slowly increased. Our grandfathers welcomed them, a Wampanoag man gently tells his son. And now they are taking everything from us. The main problem was that the English and the Wampanoag held completely different ideas about owning land. To the English, land was something an individual could own forever with the proper legal document. To the Wampanoag, land was a shared resource that belonged to everyone, and truly to no one alone. So when English settlers attempted to buy land from the native peoples, the entire agreement was filled with deep misunderstanding. The Wampanoag might have thought they were granting certain rights to use the land, while the English believed they were gaining permanent, exclusive ownership. How can any person truly own the land? A Wampanoag elder gently asked. Can you own the vast sky, the flowing river, or the unseen wind? In 1675, everything erupted when 3 Wampanoag men were put to death by English authorities for the killing of a Christian Native American named John Sassaman. The Wampanoag leader, Metacomet, who the English called King Philip, was filled with great anger. He led his warriors in fierce attacks on English settlements, beginning a conflict that would be known as King Philip's War. For the ordinary colonist, This war was truly terrifying. Imagine living in a small wooden house right at the edge of the wild forest. There were no police to call, no army close by to keep you safe. Your closest neighbors might live a mile away. At night, you heard soft, rustling sounds in the dark forest that encircled your home. Was it just the wind, a passing deer, or warriors silently preparing to attack? We slept with axes and muskets right beside our beds. One colonist later wrote, "If we managed to sleep at all." Villages such as Swansea, Taunton, Brookfield, and Deerfield were attacked. Some were completely burned to the ground. Settlers fled to bigger towns for safety, leaving behind homes and farms they had spent many years constructing. The cold winter months brought their own kind of torment. Both sides suffered through terrible conditions, disease, deep hunger, and exposure to the elements. Native American villages were destroyed, and families were torn apart. English settlements were ruined, their inhabitants killed or taken prisoner. The snow was stained red with blood, a survivor remembered. Red against white. I still see it clearly in my dreams. The English made an agreement with the Mohawk tribe, gaining an important advantage against Metacomet's warriors. The situation changed when Metacomet was killed in August of 1676 by one of his former friends, a Christian Native American named John Alderman. With Metacomet's death, the Native American resistance grew weak. The war officially concluded with the Treaty of Casco, which allowed the English to stay on all native lands in exchange for a very small payment. 1 peck of corn for each English family. This conflict completely reshaped the landscape of New England. The Native American population was drastically reduced, with many killed in battle or sold into slavery in the West Indies. The survivors were pushed further into the land or forced onto less desirable areas. The English colonies, despite suffering losses, emerged stronger and more united. But not all efforts to establish colonies were marked by such terrible violence. Around this same time, a new religious group was challenging the Anglican Church's power, the Quakers. Their beliefs were very unusual for that time. They rejected the formal church structure, refused to use titles, even speaking to the king simply as Charles, and believed in an inner light that allowed them to speak directly with God. William Penn, a well-known Quaker, saw a great opportunity. King Charles II owed Penn's father a debt of £16,000, which would be about £2.8 million in today's money. Instead of money, Penn asked for land in the New World to create a safe place for his fellow Quakers. In 1681, Charles II signed the order creating the colony of Pennsylvania. When Penn arrived in October of 1682, he established a settlement he named Philadelphia, a Greek word meaning brotherly love. His vision was truly unique, a place where all people, no matter their race, religion, or gender, could thrive equally. "This is a sacred experiment," Penn announced. "Here we will show that people with different beliefs can live together peacefully." It was was a very noble ideal, even if the reality did not completely match his grand vision. Still, Pennsylvania became well known for its religious acceptance and its fair treatment of Native Americans. Penn insisted on paying native tribes for their land, rather than simply claiming it, and he learned their languages so he could speak directly with them. While the North American colonies were expanding and developing, far across the ocean, the East India Company was gaining more and more influence. In 1639, they secured a small piece of land on the Coromandel coast of India. Do not let its small size deceive you. This tiny spot, just a strip of coastal sand dunes and tall palm trees, would become the very foundation of British power in India. Company agents Francis Day and Andrew Coggan negotiated with the local Nyack rulers to establish a trading outpost. After securing the agreement, they began building what they named Fort St. George. At first, it was just a few warehouses and simple shelters for the traders. The goal was clear and simple: to make easier the exchange of goods, mainly textiles, valuable spices, and precious metals, between India and England. But as trade became very successful, so did worries about safety. The Portuguese and Dutch also had interests in this region, and the competition was intense. The simple trading post began to change into something more solid, with strong defensive walls built around the settlement. First came the traders, an Indian observer quietly noted. Then came the soldiers. I wonder who will arrive next. Fort St. George became more than just a place for trade. It was a vital center of power, a strong foothold in a huge and rich land, the very first brick in what would become British India. Back in England, the political situation was changing once more. When Charles II died in 1685, his brother James II took the throne. Unlike Charles II, James II was openly Catholic, which was a big problem in a country that had made Anglicanism its official religion. James II appointed Catholics to powerful positions, going against the Test Act, which made such appointments unlawful. He granted rights of religious freedom throughout the land, which might sound forward-thinking to our modern ears, but this greatly angered the Anglican majority. The last and final breaking point came when James II's Catholic wife gave birth to a son, a Catholic heir who threatened to establish a lasting Catholic royal family. A Catholic king is bad enough, an Anglican bishop reportedly whispered. A Catholic royal family is simply unimaginable. A group of nobles and political leaders known as the Immortal Seven invited James II's Protestant son-in-law, William of Orange, to invade England and take the throne. William landed in 1688, and James II fled to France. This glorious revolution, named so because it involved relatively little bloodshed, led to William and Mary taking the throne and Parliament, passing the Bill of Rights, which established Parliament's power over the monarchy. When news of this revolution reached the American colonies, Protestant settlers rebelled against their Catholic governors. In New York, they removed Governor Jacob Leisler from power. Boston, they forced Sir Edmund Andros out. The French Catholics, seeing this as an attack on their faith, decided to fight back, leading to what became known as the 9 Years' War, a global conflict involving England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain against France. This war spread across Europe, North America, and the Caribbean. In America, it included the Battle of Port Royal, English attacks on French settlements in Maine, and the Siege of Pemaquid. For colonists caught in this crossfire, it was a time of deep fear and great uncertainty. Farms and villages were often raided, people were killed or taken captive, crops were burned away, livestock was stolen. The French and their Indian allies came at dawn, a New England farmer remembered. They took my neighbor's children. We never saw them again. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 brought an end to the conflict, officially recognizing William of Orange as the ruler of England and halting the French attacks. While the 9 Years' War raged across Europe and the Americas, the English were fighting their very first war in India. The English East India Company desired to expand its control in the region, but Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb refused their demands. In response, the company blocked several Mughal ports on India's western coast. The emperor fought back by seizing company factories and arresting company representatives. The Mughal fleet then blockaded the company's fort in Bombay. After a year of resistance and great famine, the company surrendered and sent representatives to beg for forgiveness. The price of peace was very high, a fine of 150,000 rupees, which is about 4.4 million pounds in today's currency. The company's representatives had to bow low before the emperor, a truly humiliating act for the proud English. Emperor Aurangzeb then ordered the blockade of Bombay to be lifted, allowing the company to re-establish itself there and create a new base in Kolkata. This defeat served as a serious reminder that despite its increasing power, the East India Company, and by extension England, was still just one player in a complex global setting. The mighty Mughal Empire remained the most powerful force in India, at least for that time. As the 17th century gently came to an end, Queen Anne took the throne in England. The way government was set up within the British Isles was unique. 4 kingdoms, 3 parliaments, and 1 single monarch. Scotland had its own parliament and laws, but it was under the rule of the British monarch. Ireland also had its own parliament, while still following the British monarch. England and Wales shared one parliament, with Wales having become more a part of English culture. But Scotland was dealing with economic problems, corruption, dwindling resources, and an increasingly powerful upper class. The wealthy believed they could increase their power by joining parliaments with England. Several Scottish officials were given money to support this union. The Earl of Glasgow, David Boyle, and the second Duke of Queensberry, James Douglas, received around £20,000, which is about £4 million today, to bring an end to the Scottish Parliament. They sold our country for gold," a Scottish farmer sadly complained. "What will they sell next? The very air we breathe." Despite strong opposition among ordinary Scots, on May the 1st, 1707, the Scottish and English parliaments joined together to form the Parliament of Great Britain, located in the Palace of Westminster in London. Any appearance of Scottish independence completely vanished, sparking anger all across Scotland. But for England, this union created the term Great Britain and marked the real beginning of what would truly become an empire. The creation of Great Britain happened at the same time as another conflict with France, known as the War of the Spanish Succession. When Spanish King Charles II died without having children, two rival claims for the throne appeared: Archduke Charles of Austria and Philip of Anjou, a relative of France's King Louis XIV. The English feared a combined French and Spanish throne would increase the power of Catholicism throughout the world, so they declared war. The conflict spread across Europe and the Americas. In America, French forces captured Fort Albany from the English. Later, English commanders Francis Nicholson and Samuel Vetch captured Port Royal in Acadia from the French, renaming it Annapolis Royal. When the war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, Philip V was recognized as the King of Spain. But England gained significant advantages: the Asiento de Negros, which gave them control of the slave trade to Spanish colonies, and new territories, including Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and parts of Rupert's Land in North America. As one imperial official once said, "We did not win the throne of Spain, but we won the world." The treaty also gave Gibraltar and Minorca to Britain, providing them with important locations in the Mediterranean Sea. Britain was becoming a major global power, with lands and influence reaching across many continents. Around this time, the Carolinas changed their society by dividing into North and South Carolina. South Carolina became a shining gem of the British Empire, with its rich land perfect for growing sugarcane. This led to a greater need for enslaved labor and the creation of the infamous slave codes of 1712, which described the brutal treatment of enslaved people. The code declared that Negroes and other slaves brought into this province for that purpose are of barbarous, wild, savage natures, and are therefore entirely unable to be governed by the laws, customs, and practices of this province. These codes established very cruel rules. Enslaved people could not leave their owner's property without specific permission. Any enslaved person trying to escape faced the penalty of death. Punishments for escaped enslaved people included public whipping, branding, having ears removed, and castration. "They do not see us as human," an enslaved man softly whispered to his son. "Remember that you are, no matter what words they speak." The slave trade grew incredibly quickly, especially in the Caribbean. Growing sugar was brutally labor-intensive, clearing land, planting, weeding, and harvesting, all in temperatures often above 100 degrees. Enslaved people worked for 18 hours each day, suffering from malnutrition and harsh mistreatment. Many died from sheer exhaustion, from disease, or from terrible abuse. Between 1710 and 1720, the English enslaved and transported about 200,000 Africans to the Americas to keep their labor force strong. They work us until we fall down, a survivor later explained. Then they bring more to take our place. We are merely tools to them, not people. As the first 25 years of the 18th century slowly passed, the British Empire continued to spread its influence. The North American colonies were growing in both population and economic value. The Caribbean islands were producing enormous wealth through the growing of sugar. Trading posts in India were becoming centers of business and power. But this expansion came with a terrible human cost: the forced removal and death of native peoples, the enslavement of Africans, and the exploitation of resources and human labor. For the ordinary person living under British rule, daily life was a constant struggle just to survive. Whether you were a farmer in New England, an enslaved person on a Caribbean plantation, or a tradesperson in a company settlement in India, your life was shaped by hard work, few opportunities, and being open to forces completely beyond your control. Yet, the British Empire continued to grow, pushed forward by ambition, by new opportunities, and by competition with other European powers. The stage was now set for even greater expansion in the coming decades, and for the conflicts that would surely follow. As you lie in your comfortable bed, far away from the harsh truths of colonial life, consider the complex, lasting impact of empire. The many innovations and achievements existed alongside exploitation and cruelty. The wealth created for some meant deep suffering for many others. And the world we live in today still carries the mark of these historical forces, for both good and bad. The year is 1732, and James Oglethorpe has a new idea. Not just any idea, but the kind of thought that makes you wonder if he had been drinking, or if he was truly onto something brilliant. His plan was to create a colony for England's poor debtors, people who had been put in prison because they could not pay what they owed. Instead of slowly decaying in jail cells, they could begin a new life in America. The English government loved this idea, not because they particularly cared about poor people, remember, but because they were worried about the Spanish in Florida moving northward. They needed a protective buffer zone, and so the colony of Georgia was born, named after King George II, because colonizers are not usually known for their great creativity when naming places. In November of 1732, 144 colonists, including Oglethorpe, boarded the ship Anne at Gravesend, England. After a long journey across the Atlantic, they arrived in Savannah on February the 12th, 1733. Unlike their neighbors in the Carolinas, Georgia at first made slavery illegal. This was not because Oglethorpe was an enlightened person against slavery, ahead of his time. It was simply practical. He wanted the colonists to farm their own small pieces of land, not to create huge plantations with enslaved labor. A small farm, honestly tended, is better than a large estate, poorly gained, and even worse managed, Oglethorpe reportedly told the settlers. There was also the concern that enslaved Africans might escape to Spanish Florida, where they were offered freedom if they joined the Spanish army. If slavery had been allowed, there would have been little to stop enslaved people from making the Spanish forces stronger. Picture yourself now as one of these new Georgian colonists. You had spent months, perhaps even years, in a debtor's prison in London. The conditions were truly horrific. Too many people crowded together, rampant disease, and constant starvation. People died every single day. The terrible smell was unbearable. Human waste, unwashed bodies, infection, and the scent of death. Now you are in Georgia. The air feels different. Humid, yes. Sometimes so thick it felt suffocating, but still clean. There are insects here you have never seen before, some as large as your thumb. The forests seem to go on forever. The soil is rich and dark. You have land, real land that now belongs to you. It is like a dream come true, except for the part where you might die from malaria, from hunger, or from Spanish attacks. But still, at least you are not in prison any longer. Speaking of the Spanish, the connection between England and Spain was about to change. A challenging relationship would soon become much more serious. The unusual series of events that began this change centered on a single human ear. This is a true story. In the year 1731, a British merchant by the name of Robert Jenkins had a reputation for raiding Spanish vessels. One afternoon, a Spanish ship captured Jenkins. As a punishment, they removed his ear. Afterward, Jenkins did what anyone in his position might think to do. He kept the ear in a jar of brandy and traveled with it for the next 7 years. In 1738, he showed his preserved ear to the British Parliament. The members of Parliament were very upset and called for a response. The conflict that resulted came to be called the War of Jenkins' Ear. It is a peculiar but true part of our story this evening. For 8 years, Britain and Spain tried to find peaceful answers to their problems. But in January of 1740, a man named James Oglethorpe led his Georgia militia into Florida. They took control of 2 Spanish forts, but soon saw they did not have enough men to capture the city of St. Augustine. Because of this, they had to turn back. The Spanish responded in the summer of 1742, arriving on St. Simon's Island. Oglethorpe's soldiers defeated them in the Battle of Bloody Marsh. This victory made the Spanish retreat to St. Augustine. A soldier from Georgia later remembered that the Spanish arrived feeling very sure of themselves, but they left behind their fallen men. The War of Jenkins' Ear was not only a conflict in the Americas. It also reached far across the world to India. There, the British East India Company and the French East India Company were both seeking more influence in the Carnatic area of southern India. The British and their Indian allies supported one candidate for the Carnatic throne. The French, led by their ambitious governor-general, supported another. In 1744, the French were victorious over the British at the Battle of Adyar, which demonstrated their greater military ability. Encouraged by this, they surrounded the British city of Madras in 1746 and forced a surrender. This struggle eventually became part of the War of the Austrian Succession. That was a larger European war, with many countries fighting over territory in Austria. By 1748, everyone involved was weary of the fighting. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle returned most places to how they were before the war started. This meant Madras went back to British control, even though it had been lost in a battle. Back in Georgia, the question of slavery came up once more. Oglethorpe continued to be against it. However, many colonists saw the riches of their neighbors in Carolina and wanted to bring enslaved Africans to Georgia. They would ask why they should work in the fields themselves when their neighbors grew wealthy from the work of others. Since enslaved people were already being brought illegally from South Carolina, Oglethorpe's rule could not be upheld. On the 1st of January, 1751, slavery was made legal in Georgia, with rules much like those in South Carolina. This decision ended up hurting the people Oglethorpe had wanted to protect. Wealthy plantation owners from South Carolina moved to Georgia with their enslaved workers. They established large farms that smaller farmers could not compete against. In the meantime, far away in the forests of North America, there was a region called the Ohio Valley. It contained 300,000 acres of valuable land. The Ohio Company of Virginia, founded by Augustine Washington, who was George Washington's father, hoped to profit from this land. A young George Washington was tasked with surveying the area. What he found there was a cause for concern. The land was already home to the Shawnee and Delaware peoples, who were not pleased with British movement into their territory. The French were also present, with fortifications like Fort Duquesne, located where two rivers, the Allegheny and Monongahela, come together. In April of 1754, while tensions grew between the British and the French, a 22-year-old Washington guided a small group of soldiers into the valley. In a peaceful, remote area, they encountered a French group led by Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. What happened in that moment is still a matter of discussion. The British claimed a fight began. The French described it as a targeted attack. Regardless of how it happened, Jumonville was left dead. The French sought to avenge this and surrounded Washington and his soldiers at a quickly built fort called Fort Necessity. With fewer men, Washington gave up on the 3rd of July, 1754. The document he signed stated he had assassinated Jumonville. Washington later explained that he had not understood the French words in the document. This small clash in the Pennsylvania woods was the spark for what would be known as the 7 Years' War. It was a conflict that spanned the globe, taking place on 3 continents, including Europe, the Americas, and India. For the everyday people caught in this global war, life became a time of great difficulty and worry. In North America, frontier settlements were vulnerable to attacks from French soldiers and their Native American allies. One Pennsylvania farmer recalled that they slept with their guns loaded and ready, and the children knew to go to the cellar at the first sign of trouble. In Europe, armies moved across the land, taking food from farmers who were already finding it hard to get by. Young men were made to join the army, leaving farms unattended and families without support. A German farmer sadly explained that the soldiers took all they had, from their grain and animals to the very seeds for the next planting season, leaving them to wonder how they would survive. In India, local populations were caught between the competing European powers and had to choose sides in conflicts that were not their own. The war started poorly for the British. In 1756, the governor of Bengal, Suraj ud-Dawla, captured Fort William in Calcutta, which was the base for the British East India Company. When his soldiers entered the fort, they put 146 Englishmen into a very small room. It was only meant to hold them until the morning. The conditions were so poor that, according to a survivor named John Howell, 123 of the prisoners died during the night from the extreme heat and lack of water and air. This event was named the Black Hole of Calcutta. The British were determined to reclaim the fort and seek justice for what had happened. They sent an officer named Robert Clive to meet Suraj's army at the village of Plassey in Bengal. Imagine the scene. Two armies are lined up on a hot day in June of 1757. Suraj's army was much bigger than Clive's, but the situation was not what it appeared to be. Clive had secretly formed an alliance with local leaders who were not happy with Suraj, including a man named Mir Jafar. When the battle started, Mir Jafar and his followers changed sides, which gave the British the advantage. Suraj was captured and later executed. Mir Jafar was made the new governor, but he was a leader who was guided by the British. With this one victory, the British East India Company gained control over Bengal, the most prosperous region in all of India. It was a significant moment in the story of British influence in South Asia. In North America, the French had the upper hand at first. But in 1758, British General Geoffrey Amherst captured the fortress of Louisbourg on Canada's eastern coast after a long attack from the sea. A British Marine later wrote that the cannons sounded day and night, and the fortress walls fell apart like sandcastles against the waves. The next year, British soldiers under General James Wolfe set their sights on Quebec, the center of French Canada. After some early failures, Wolfe developed a daring plan. In the dark of night, British soldiers scaled cliffs that seemed impossible to climb and appeared on the Plains of Abraham. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham on September 13th, 1759, was brief, but it was final. Both Wolfe and the French commander Montcalm were fatally injured. As Wolfe was dying, he heard that the British had won. He is said to have whispered that now he could die in peace. Quebec surrendered to the British on September 18th, 1759. The following year, Montreal, the last French base in North America, also surrendered. In India, the British victories continued. At Wandiwash in southern India, British soldiers under General Eyre Coote defeated the French, who were led by Comte de Lally Tollendal. The French base of Pondicherry was captured in January of 1761, which ended French power in the region. The British also took control of Caribbean islands from both the French and the Spanish, including Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, Grenada, and Havana. When it was time to discuss peace, Britain was in a very strong position. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formally recognized Britain's powerful new role. France gave Canada to Britain, along with all its lands east of the Mississippi River. Spain gave Florida to Britain in return for getting Havana back. In India, the treaty solidified British authority over Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. Britain had become the most powerful nation in the world, with an empire that reached across North America, the Caribbean, and large areas of India. But this victory created its own challenges. The British government was deeply in debt from the enormous expense of the 7 Years' War. To avoid more costly fights with Native Americans, they created the Proclamation of 1763. This established a boundary line along the Appalachian Mountains, from Nova Scotia down to Florida. Colonists were told they could not move west of this line. This proclamation greatly upset the American colonists. They believed they were entitled to the lands they had helped win in the war. The Ohio Company, which was already operating in the restricted area, simply paid no attention to the new regulation. A Virginia frontiersman declared that they had won the land with their own efforts, and no king far away could tell them they could not settle it. The British government's concerns were proven right when the Ottawa Chief Pontiac began a series of coordinated attacks on British forts in May of 1763. Native American warriors surrounded Fort Detroit, Fort Michilimackinac, and Fort Sandusky. The British were taken by surprise by how well organized and fierce these attacks were. Colonel Henry Bouquet managed to end the siege at Fort Pitt, which used to be Fort Duquesne, after the intense battle of Bushy Run. Pontiac showed he was not just a warrior, but also a skilled diplomat, creating alliances between different tribes. By 1764, however, the momentum of the rebellion began to slow as many tribal leaders started to think that more fighting would not give them the outcome they desired. Talks began, and peace was eventually restored. As the 1760s progressed, Britain was at the height of its imperial strength. It had overcome its main rival, France, and had acquired vast new lands around the globe. The British Empire now consisted of 13 colonies on the eastern coast of North America, provinces in Canada, islands in the Caribbean, and important territories in India. But trouble was gathering on the horizon. The American colonists, who who had fought with British soldiers in the 7 Years' War, were starting to feel uneasy under the Empire's rule. The British government's efforts to pay for the war by taxing the colonies would soon lead to a resistance that would alter the course of the Empire's history. For the moment, however, Britain basked in its victory. The British flag flew over forts and trading posts from the cold shores of Hudson Bay to the warm beaches of the Caribbean, and from the forests of North America to the open plains of Bengal. It was the beginning of what historians would later name the First British Empire. As you gently drift toward sleep, consider the vastness of this global struggle that changed the entire world. Armies clashed on different continents, navies battled on distant oceans, and empires rose and fell. All the while, ordinary people were just trying to live through these extraordinary times. The story of the British Empire is one of great ambition and accomplishment, but it is also a story of hardship and deep struggle. And we are not yet halfway through this long tale. In the years to come, Britain will face new challenges, including the most important crisis for the empire, which was the American Revolution. The year is 1763, and Great Britain has just become the most powerful country on the planet. After its victory over France in the 7 Years' War, the British Empire now covers North America and the Caribbean, and it has a strong presence in India. The sun, it was said, never set on British lands. But with immense power came immense costs, and Britain was burdened by war debt. In a private meeting, the Prime Minister asked Parliament who should help pay for the war. Another member of Parliament replied that the colonists should, of course. He argued that the war was fought to protect them, so they should help with the expense. This decision, which seemed simple at the time, would go on to change the direction of history. The British government felt it was perfectly fair to ask the colonists to contribute to the empire's defense. So, it passed the Stamp Act of 1765. This new law made American colonists pay a tax on nearly every piece of paper they used. This applied to legal papers, newspapers, playing cards, and even dice. Anything that was printed had to have an official stamp, which had to be purchased with real money that was sent directly to the British government. For the colonists, who were accustomed to managing their own taxes through their local governments, this direct tax from Parliament was a new and unwelcome development. No taxation without representation became their well-known cry of opposition. They argued that because they had no representatives elected to Parliament, Parliament did not have the right to tax them directly. The response was swift and powerful. Colonists stopped buying British products. Tax collectors were subjected to being tarred and feathered. You can be sure that this is not a pleasant thing to go through. Imagine having hot, sticky tar poured over your body, followed by a covering of feathers that cling to the tar. It is a painful and humiliating experience that could even be fatal if the tar was too hot. Seeing this strong opposition, Parliament cancelled the Stamp Act, but it right away passed the Declaratory Act. This act stated that Parliament had, and rightfully should have, complete power and authority to create laws that were strong enough to be binding on the colonies and people of America in all situations. In simple terms, they were saying, we can do whatever we want with our colonies. Meanwhile, far across the ocean in India, the British East India Company was making its power stronger after its important victory at the Battle of Plassey. After dealing with the British East India Company for more than 100 years, the once great Mughal Empire was weakening and nearing its end. In 1765, the company made a deal, the Treaty of Allahabad, with the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II. This treaty gave the company Diwani rights, which meant it had the right to collect taxes in the regions of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. One official from the East India Company remarked that they had come as traders, but were now ruling like kings. This was a major shift. The company was no longer just a trading business. It was now effectively running the government, collecting taxes, and overseeing justice. It was becoming a part of the British Empire, with its own soldiers, its own system of government, and its own foreign relations. For the regular Indian person living under the company's authority, life changed in ways that were subtle but significant. The company introduced new farming methods aimed at getting the most profit. Local businesses that were in competition with British products were intentionally slowed down. Traditional systems of power were disrupted as the company gave its support to those who worked with its goals. An Indian farmer complained that the foreigners counted everything, every bit of rice, every single cow, and every chicken, all so they could take their portion. Back in America, the disagreements continued to grow slowly. In 1767, Parliament approved the Townshend Acts, which put taxes on tea, paper, glass, lead, and paint brought into the colonies. Once more, the colonists resisted by refusing to purchase British items. On March 5th, 1770, the tension finally reached a breaking point in Boston. British soldiers fired their guns into a crowd of colonists, and 5 people lost their lives. The event was quickly called the Boston Massacre by colonial newspapers and became a strong symbol of anti-British sentiment. Picture the scene. It is a cold winter evening in the city of Boston. Snow and ice are on the frozen streets. A crowd of colonists has formed outside the custom house. They are yelling at the British soldiers who are on duty there. The air is very tense and filled with a feeling of hostility. The colonists begin to throw snowballs, then oyster shells, and then pieces of ice. The soldiers, feeling outnumbered and increasingly worried, try to keep their composure. Then, something happens. The stories of what took place are different, but shots were fired. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists were on the ground in the snow, either dead or dying. Their blood turned the white ground a dark red. Someone shouted that it was murder, that the redcoats had murdered their brothers. News of what happened spread through the colonies like a wildfire. Paul Revere made a famous engraving that showed the event as a planned massacre. British soldiers firing in unison into a peaceful group of people. It was a form of propaganda, but it was very powerful. In an unexpected development, John Adams, a prominent advocate for the colonists' rights, chose to defend the British soldiers in court. Even with his own views on British rules, he believed in the importance of the law and the right to a fair trial. He told the jury that facts are stubborn things, and no matter what people wished or felt, they could not alter the evidence. 6 of the 8 soldiers were found not guilty. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, but received lesser punishments. The outcome of the trial did not do much to soothe the colonists' anger. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. This law gave the British East India Company the sole right to sell tea in the colonies. Although this actually lowered the price of tea for the colonists, they viewed it as another effort to make them agree to Parliament's right to tax them. On December 16th, 1773, a group of colonists dressed as Mohawk Indians went aboard 3 British ships in Boston Harbor. They threw 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party, as it became known, was a direct act of defiance against British rule. One of the participants later joked that he had never had saltier tea. Parliament's answer was the coercive acts, which the colonists referred to as the Intolerable Acts. These new laws shut down Boston Harbor, revoked Massachusetts' charter, permitted soldiers to be housed in private residences, and protected British officials from being tried in colonial courts. For the residents of Boston, the closing of their harbor was an economic catastrophe. Ships were unable to come or go, which meant that goods could not be brought in or sent out. Businesses closed. People lost their jobs and their livelihoods. Food became hard to find and very costly. A Boston resident told his family during a small meal that the British planned to starve them. The other colonies supported Boston by sending food and supplies. More importantly, they started to view Britain's actions not just as something affecting one colony, but as a danger to the freedoms of all of them. In September of 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They stated that the coercive acts were against the Constitution, encouraged people to get weapons, and planned for another Congress to meet if their issues were not resolved. While the American colonies were moving toward open conflict, Britain was extending its influence in other areas. In 1768, Captain James Cook departed on the HMS Endeavour to explore the South Pacific. After years of challenging sea voyages, Cook and his team arrived in the southern hemisphere. In April of 1770, they came across an unknown landmass, the continent of Australia. Cook landed at a location now called Botany Bay, in the area that would become New South Wales. When he and his crew stepped ashore, they encountered a landscape that was completely new to them. It had unusual plants and animals and native inhabitants who had lived on this land for thousands of years. One sailor noted in his journal that the air smelled different there, spicy and sharp, unlike anything in England. Cook and his crew spent many months charting the eastern coast of this huge continent. They sailed to the north, creating detailed maps as they went. Cook was a very skilled navigator, and his precise measurements and map making were exceptional. As they continued north, they observed a variety of environments, from thick rainforests to stunning beaches and coral reefs. They saw strange animals, creatures that hopped on strong back legs and carried their young in pouches, furry animals that climbed trees and ate leaves, and birds with bright feathers that could imitate human sounds. One crew member wrote that if he had not seen it for himself, he would have thought the others were telling stories just to trick him. The world's newest and most dangerous frontier had been found. Cook claimed it for Britain, overlooking the fact that the land was already the home of hundreds of native nations with their own intricate societies, languages, and cultures. This way of European powers claiming lands already occupied by native peoples had happened all over the world, from North America to the Caribbean, to India, and to Australia. The growth of the British Empire often resulted in the displacement, control, or elimination of native populations. Back in the American colonies, events were quickly heading toward a showdown. In April of 1775, British soldiers marched from Boston to the nearby towns of Lexington and Concord. Their goal was to take colonial weapons and arrest revolutionary figures. Colonial militiamen, who had been alerted by Paul Revere and others, met the British soldiers. Shots were fired. It is not known for sure who fired the first shot. This was the start of the American Revolution. The shot heard round the world, as Ralph Waldo Emerson would later describe it, set off a series of events that would result in the first major loss of British colonial land. As the fighting escalated, the colonists created the Continental Army, led by George Washington. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, officially cutting all connections with Great Britain. The document states that they hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are given by their Creator certain rights that cannot be taken away, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The ideas in this declaration would inspire movements for freedom and self-rule around the world for many years to come, including, as it happens, in other areas of the British Empire. For Britain, the American Revolution was the first significant test of its imperial strength. If the 13 colonies could successfully separate, what would prevent other colonies from doing the same? The war was a global one, with France, Spain, and the Netherlands eventually siding with the Americans. British soldiers had to face not only colonial militias, but also professional European armies and navies. For ordinary people involved in the conflict, life was a constant challenge. Armies on both sides took food and supplies from farms and villages. rulers turned on one another, as those loyal to the king fought against those who wanted independence. A woman in Massachusetts told her children that her brother fought for the king, while their father fought for independence, and if they met in battle, one might end the other's life, which was the heavy cost of war. After several years of fighting, the war's direction changed for good at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. British General Charles Cornwallis, who was trapped by American and French forces, surrendered. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war, and Britain acknowledged the independence of the United States. The British Empire had lost its 13 American colonies, which was a major blow to its standing and power. But the empire was far from over. Even as it was losing land in North America, it was growing in other parts of the world. The loss of the American colonies actually made Britain more interested in India, Africa, and the Pacific as new sources of imperial wealth and strength. In India, the East India Company kept extending its control. After the Treaty of Allahabad, the company was effectively in charge of Bengal, India's wealthiest province. Under Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of India, the company started to behave less like a business and more like a government. The company's rule brought changes to Indian society and its economy. Traditional industries were held back as the company favored goods that could be sent to Britain. Farming methods were altered to concentrate on crops for sale, not for food. Local power systems were changed as the company supported rulers who were friendly to its goals. An Indian textile worker complained that the foreigners change everything. They want them to grow indigo instead of food, to buy their cloth instead of making their own, and to become something they are not. For the British, India was increasingly seen as the jewel in the imperial crown. The wealth taken from the subcontinent through trade, taxes, and exploitation helped power Britain's industrial revolution and funded more imperial growth. In Africa, British activity was still mostly centered on the slave trade and coastal trading posts. The inside of the continent was largely unknown to Europeans, but this would change in the following decades as the scramble for Africa started. Australia, after Cook's journey, was seen as a potential location for a new colony. The loss of the American colonies had created a problem for Britain about where to send its convicts. Before the Revolution, many British convicts were sent to America. Now, a new place was needed. In 1786, the British government chose to set up a penal colony at Botany Bay. The first fleet, with convicts and their guards, reached Australia in January of 1788, although they actually settled at the nearby Sydney Cove instead of Botany Bay. For the convicts, being sent to Australia was a frightening ordeal. The trip took many months, and the ships faced storms, illness, and a lack of food and water. When they got there, they had the hard job of starting a settlement in an unfamiliar and often difficult environment. One convict wrote in a secret letter that God had abandoned the place. He described the sun as burning like the fires of hell, strange animals hiding in the bushes, the natives watching with suspicion, and the overseers being like devils in human form. Despite these many difficulties, the colony managed to survive and eventually expand. What started as a settlement for prisoners would, in time, become an important part of the British Empire. As the 18th century came to an end, the British Empire was at a turning point. It had experienced a significant loss with the American Revolution, but it kept growing in other areas of the world. The very character of the empire was also shifting, from one that was mainly focused on trade to one that was more and more about controlling land and settlement. The next century would present new challenges and new chances. The Industrial Revolution would change Britain's economy and society, creating a new drive for imperial expansion. Revolutionary ideas, partly inspired by the American and French revolutions, would spread across the empire, questioning the old ideas of authority and social order. And Britain would have to compete with new rivals for imperial power, especially from European countries like France and Germany, and later from non-European countries like Japan and the United States. But through all of this, the British Empire would continue to grow, reaching its peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was before the forces it had helped create, like nationalism, democracy, and anti-colonial feelings, started to lead to its decline. As you drift closer to sleep, think about the huge size of this empire at its peak. It covered continents and included a wide variety of peoples and cultures, influencing the modern world in ways that were both good and bad. Its legacy can still be seen in our language, our legal systems, our political structures, and the borders of many countries. The story of the British Empire is a detailed picture of ambition and ideals, of exploitation and opportunity, and of cruelty and courage. It is a story of regular people who were caught up in amazing historical events, trying to make their way in a changing world. And it is a story that continues to affect our present and our future, even though the empire itself is now a part of history. As the 19th century begins, Britain is on the verge of a change that will affect not just the empire, but the entire globe. Steam engines hiss and clatter in factories all over northern England. Coal mines reach deeper and deeper into the earth. Ironworks cast a bright orange glow against the dark night sky. The Industrial Revolution has truly started. Imagine walking through the city of Manchester in the year 1800. The air is heavy with smoke from coal, so thick that sometimes in the middle of the day, it feels like evening. Your lungs sting with each breath you take. Your eyes water. Soot covers your clothes, your hair, and even gets between your teeth. The sound is non-stop, the metal sound of machines, the hiss of steam, the calls of workers, and the sound of carts on the stone streets. And underneath it all, there is a constant hum of power. Not political power, but real physical energy being harnessed, controlled, and put to use. A visiting French merchant noted that it was as if the whole world suddenly woke up and decided to start making things. Britain is now the world's workshop, making textiles, machinery, ships, and many other products at a speed never before seen. This industrial strength powers the growth of the empire. It provides both the tools, like advanced weapons and steamships, and the reasons, the need for raw materials and markets, for more conquest. One of the first places of interest is India. The East India Company has been slowly increasing its control since the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Under Richard Wellesley, who was the Governor-General from 1798 to 1805, the company started a policy of taking over land directly. Wellesley used a method he called subsidiary alliances. Indian rulers who agreed to these deals got British protection, but they had to have a British representative at their court and could not make deals with other states without British approval. It was protection in the same way a crime boss protects a local shop. A British official explained to an Indian prince that the choice was very simple. They could accept their friendship or face their opposition. Most chose friendship, which slowly became control. By 1818, the company was effectively in charge of most of the Indian subcontinent, either directly or through rulers they controlled. For the average Indian person, the company's rule led to big changes. Traditional industries, like textiles, were intentionally slowed down to help British manufacturers. Local artisans, who were once known for their expert work, found themselves without jobs as cheap. Factory-made British products filled the market. A weaver from Bengal told his son that his father used to make cloth for the Maharaja, but now he made cloth for no one. Farming methods also shifted, with a new emphasis on cash crops like cotton, indigo, and opium for export, instead of food for the local people. This change made people more susceptible to famine when the crops failed. The British explained their rule with what they called a civilizing mission. This was the belief that they were bringing progress, education, and enlightenment to less developed peoples. James Mill, in his important book, History of British India, claimed that Indian civilization was stagnant and inferior, and that it needed British help to improve. His son, John Stuart Mill, who worked for the East India Company, stated it very clearly that despotism is a valid form of government when dealing with barbarians, as long as the goal is their improvement. This viewpoint, a mix of arrogance and a sense of fatherly duty, became a main part of British imperialism. The British believed they were doing the people they ruled a favor by governing them. At the same time, Britain's industrial requirements led to a conflict with the world's most ancient empire, China. British merchants wanted to sell their manufactured items to the huge Chinese market, but the Chinese were largely self-reliant and had little desire for British products. There was, however, one British product they did want, and that was opium, which was grown in India under the company's control. Opium was brought into China in very large amounts, creating millions of addicts and taking away China's silver. When the Chinese government attempted to halt this harmful trade, Britain declared war, not just once, but twice. The Opium Wars, which occurred from 1839 to 1842, and from 1856 to 1860, resulted in British victories. They compelled China to open its ports to foreign trade and to give Hong Kong to British rule. A British naval officer later admitted in his private journal that they went to war because the Chinese would not let them sell drugs to their people, and he wondered how they managed to sleep at night. The Treaty of Nanking, which concluded the First Opium War, was the first of what the Chinese would later refer to as the unequal treaties, agreements that were imposed on them by Western powers. It was a pattern that would persist throughout the century, gradually weakening China and playing a part in the downfall of its imperial system. In 1837, a young woman named Victoria ascended to the throne of the United Kingdom. Her reign, which continued until 1901, would align with the zenith of British imperial power. During this Victorian era, the empire grew significantly, particularly in Africa. The early part of Victoria's reign saw the end of slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833. While this was the right thing to do morally, it presented economic difficulties for the colonies that relied on slave labor, especially in the Caribbean. Britain's answer was to find new sources of workers, which were indentured servants from India. They signed contracts to work on plantations for a set amount of time in return for their passage and a small wage. It was not technically slavery, but the conditions were often hardly any better. An Indian laborer in Trinidad wrote home that they were promised a paradise, but found a hell instead. In Africa, Britain's presence was still small. In the early 19th century, there were settlements in Sierra Leone, which was established as a safe place for freed slaves, and the Cape Colony, which was taken from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars. But the interior of the continent was still mostly unexplored by Europeans. This started to change with the journeys of explorers like David Livingstone, who mapped a large part of Central Africa between 1841 and 1873. Livingstone, a Scottish missionary, was motivated by a wish to stop the slave trade and to bring Christianity and commerce to Africa. When Livingstone disappeared for 6 years, the New York Herald sent a journalist named Henry Morton Stanley to find him. Their meeting near Lake Tanganyika in 1871 led to one of the most famous greetings in all of history. Dr. Livingstone, I presume. These explorations revealed the African interior to European knowledge and, consequently, to European exploitation. By the 1880s, various European powers were rushing to claim African lands. Back in India, the increasing power of the East India Company was a concern even to the British government. The company had its own army, collected taxes, administered justice, and was effectively in charge of millions of people, all while officially being a commercial business. This contradiction became unsustainable in 1857, when a huge rebellion, which the British called the Sepoy Mutiny, and Indian nationalists called the First War of Independence broke out across northern India. The immediate reason was a rumor that new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, which was offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. But the deeper reasons were much more profound. Resentment of foreign rule, fear of Christian missionaries, and anger at being economically exploited. The rebellion was characterized by terrible actions on both sides. Indian rebels killed British civilians, including women and children, in places like Kanpur. British forces reacted with widespread violence, executing suspected rebels by tying them to the mouths of cannons and firing. A British officer wrote with disgust that they were hanging everyone with a brown face, with no trial or evidence, just a rope and a tree. After the rebellion was suppressed, the British government decided that the East India Company's rule had to end. The Government of India Act moved all of the company's territories and powers directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. She ruled the subcontinent through a viceroy and a complex governmental system staffed mainly by the Indian Civil Service, a select group of British administrators. This time saw efforts to change Indian society based on British values. Practices like sati, which was the burning of widows, and thuggee, which was ritual robbery and murder on highways, were stopped. Western education was introduced. This created an Indian elite who were fluent in English and familiar with Western ideas, including the concepts of democracy, nationalism, and self-rule, which would later be used against the British. An Indian student noted with a knowing smile that they were taught about freedom in their schools. And then the British acted surprised when they wanted it for themselves. The mid-Victorian era also saw Britain involved in European conflicts, most importantly the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856, which was a fight against Russia. This war, fought mostly on the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea, is significant for several reasons. It was one of the first wars to be heavily photographed and reported on by war correspondents, which brought the realities of battle to the British public in a way never seen before. It introduced Florence Nightingale and her nurses, who transformed military medicine, and it showed serious flaws in the British military system, which resulted in reforms. But for the regular British soldier, the Crimean War was a terrible experience of incompetence and hardship. Men died unnecessarily from disease and cold due to poor supplies and planning. The famous charge of the Light Brigade, where a British cavalry unit charged Russian artillery because of mixed-up orders, became a symbol of the war's poor management. The poet Alfred Lord Tennyson would later write about the charge. "Theirs not to reason why, slash theirs but to do and die," capturing both the bravery and the pointlessness of the action. Despite these difficulties, Britain came out of the mid-century as the world's most powerful nation. Its navy controlled the seas. Its factories made goods that were sold all over the world. London was the financial center of the world, and the pound sterling was the main international currency. The late Victorian period witnessed the most significant growth of the British Empire, especially in Africa. The scramble for Africa truly began after the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers set up rules for claiming African lands. The attendees of the conference were all European, with no African representatives. They literally drew lines on maps, dividing the continent among themselves with little consideration for existing political structures, ethnic groups, or geographical features. One horrified observer noted that they were cutting up Africa like a cake. Britain claimed huge territories, including what would become Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan, among others. Cecil Rhodes, a British businessman and a strong supporter of the empire, established British control over what became Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe and Zambia. Rhodes had a dream of a British Africa that reached from Cape to Cairo, with a railway connecting these two ends of the continent. The railway was never finished, but the British did create an almost continuous line of territories from South Africa to Egypt. For Africans, the imposition of colonial rule was a deeply disruptive experience. Traditional political systems were taken apart or put under colonial control. Land and resources were taken away. Labor was forced through taxes that pushed people into the money-based economy. A Kenyan elder later remembered that the white man came with a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. He told them to close their eyes and pray. When they opened them, he had the land and they had the Bible. Colonial administrators justified their rule with the same civilizing mission argument that was used in India. They claimed to be bringing progress, Christianity, and commerce to less developed peoples. The reality was a system created mainly to benefit Britain economically and strategically. Yet the empire was not without its critics. Even within Britain, writers like Edmund Burke had criticized the excesses of the empire in India as early as the 1780s. By the late 19th century, voices like John A. Hobson were questioning the morality and even the economic benefit of imperialism. Hobson asked what the empire was for and who truly benefited from it. For most ordinary British people, the empire was a distant and abstract idea. They saw it in exhibitions, newspapers, and popular culture as exotic animals, strange peoples, and exciting stories of adventure and conquest. But very few ever went to the colonies, and even fewer understood the reality of colonial rule. The sun never sets on the British Empire was a popular saying, showing pride in its global presence. What was left unsaid was the other side of that saying, that somewhere in the empire, it is always the darkest night. As the 19th century comes to an end, the British Empire is at its largest size. It covers nearly a quarter of the world's land and rules over about 450 million people, which was around 1/4 of the world's population at that time. But beneath this seeming strength, there were signs of trouble. Other countries, especially Germany and the United States, were industrializing quickly and challenging British economic dominance. Nationalist movements were beginning to stir in various colonies, partly inspired by Western ideas of self-governance. The costs of keeping the empire, both military, administrative, and moral, were becoming more and more obvious. The Boer War, from 1899 to 1902 in South Africa, revealed the harshness of imperial conquest. British forces gathered Boer civilians into concentration camps, where thousands died from disease and malnutrition. A British journalist wrote that they were fighting to keep control over people who clearly did not want to be controlled by them. As you drift closer to sleep, think about the contradictions of the Victorian Empire at its peak. There was material progress alongside human exploitation, ideals of liberty and justice alongside the realities of conquest and control, and confident claims of civilizational superiority alongside the often brutal ways used to impose that civilization. The British Empire in this era shaped the modern world in many ways. It drew borders that still exist today. It spread the English language around the globe, and it set up political and legal systems that are still in use. Its legacy is complex and debated, inspiring both pride and shame, admiration and anger. And as the 20th century begins, this empire, the largest in human history, will face challenges that will ultimately lead to its end, returning to the status of the small island nation from which it started. But that is a story for another part of our journey through the rise and fall of the British Empire. As the 20th century begins, the British Empire is at its greatest territorial extent. The world map is dotted with pink, the color indicating British territories that span every continent. A quarter of the Earth's land and a quarter of its people are under British authority. Queen Victoria, the symbol of the empire, passes away in January of 1901 after a 63-year reign. Her son, Edward VII, inherits not just a throne, but a global giant that appears timeless and strong. Yet, beneath this outward strength, signs of weakness are emerging. Imagine being in London in the year 1901. The city is alive with energy and self-assurance. Huge buildings made of Portland stone line the streets, banks, government offices, and museums, all constructed to stand for centuries. The empire's wealth runs through the city's veins. In the shops on Regent Street, one can purchase silk from China, tea from India, tobacco from Virginia, coffee from Jamaica, and chocolate from West Africa. The Times newspaper declares that the century starts with Britain at the height of world power and wonders what greatness lies ahead. But a different picture appears if you look closer. In London's East End, poverty is widespread. Children with pale faces and tattered clothes ask for money on street corners. Workers live in crowded tenements where illness spreads quickly. The The empire's wealth benefits some, but it does not benefit everyone. And in the colonies themselves, the sounds of discontent are getting louder. In India, the Indian National Congress, which was formed in 1885, is changing from a loyal opposition group to a stronger voice for Indian rights and, eventually, for independence. In Ireland, the calls for self-government are growing stronger. In Africa, the first signs of nationalist feelings are appearing among the Western educated elites. The new century also brings new competitors. Germany, which had only been a unified country since 1871, is rapidly industrializing and creating a navy to challenge British sea power. The United States, having recovered from its civil war as a single nation, is becoming an economic giant. Japan, transformed by the Meiji Restoration, defeats Russia in 1905, becoming the first Asian power in modern times to beat a European one. British leaders are aware of these challenges. Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial secretary from 1895 to 1903, suggests imperial preference, a system of trade tariffs that would tie the empire together more closely economically. But the idea of free trade is deeply ingrained in British thought, and his ideas are met with opposition. In 1902, Britain forms an alliance with Japan, acknowledging that it can no longer maintain naval dominance in every ocean at once. In 1904, the Entente cordiale with France puts an end to centuries of Anglo-French rivalry. In 1907, an agreement with Russia finalizes the Triple Entente. These diplomatic actions show a new reality. Britain is no longer powerful enough to stand by itself. It now requires allies. Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne admits that the days of splendid isolation are finished. The first truly global test for the empire arrives in 1914 with the start of World War I. Britain joins the conflict after Germany invades neutral Belgium. But the war soon becomes a fight for imperial dominance as well as European control. For the typical British soldier, many of whom were from working-class families, the war was a horror beyond anything they could have imagined. In the trenches of the Western Front, men lived in terrible conditions, knee-deep in mud. Rats grew large on the bodies of the fallen. Lice infested their unwashed skin. The constant artillery fire drove some men to madness. A young lieutenant wrote to his mother that the noise never ceased, and he heard it even in his sleep, wondering if he would ever know quiet again. Death arrived in many ways, from artillery shells, machine gun fire, poison gas, and disease. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, Britain had nearly 60,000 casualties, with almost 20,000 dead, the deadliest day in its entire military history. The Empire mobilized for this critical fight. Over 2.5 million Indian troops and laborers took part in the conflict. Soldiers came from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the West Indies. Resources were sent from every colony to help the war effort. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith declared that the empire upon which the sun never sets has risen as one to meet this challenge. But the war strained the connections of the empire, even as it showed imperial unity. In Ireland, nationalists organized the Easter Rising in 1916. It was harshly put down, but it prepared the way for the Irish War of Independence a few years later. In India, the hope of being rewarded for loyalty and service grew. An Indian soldier wrote from the Western Front that they were used as cannon fodder and wondered if they would be seen as equals when it was all over. For the Muslims in the empire, there was a special problem. As Britain fought against the Ottoman Empire, whose sultan was the caliph, the spiritual leader of Islam, this created tension in India, Egypt, and other Muslim majority areas under British rule. After 4 terrible years, the war concluded with an Allied victory. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires all fell. Britain and its empire seemed to emerge stronger, acquiring new territories as mandates from the League of Nations, including Palestine, Iraq, and parts of German East Africa. At the Paris Peace Conference, the British dominions, which were Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, signed the Treaty of Versailles on their own, a sign of their increasing autonomy within the imperial structure. But the price was immense, nearly 1 million dead from Britain and its empire, massive financial debts, and social disruption. The pre-war world of stability and confidence was gone for good. A British diplomat at Versailles observed that they had won the war, but he was not sure they had won the peace. The years after the war brought new difficulties. In Ireland, the War of Independence from 1919 to 1921 led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the establishment of the Irish Free State, with 6 counties in Ulster staying as part of the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. It was the first major loss of territory for the empire since American independence. In India, growing nationalist feeling led to the Amritsar massacre in 1919, when British soldiers fired on an unarmed crowd, killing hundreds. This event strengthened the independence movement under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, who called for nonviolent resistance to British rule. Gandhi told his followers that the British governed India because they cooperated with them, and if they stopped cooperating, the British could not govern. In Egypt, a revolution in 1919 resulted in nominal independence in 1922, although Britain kept significant control, especially over the Suez Canal. In Iraq, a revolt in 1920 against the British Mandate was put down at a great cost. These post-war troubles reflected a changing world. The principle of self-determination, promoted by American President Woodrow Wilson, inspired nationalist movements across the colonized world. The Russian Revolution of 1917 presented an alternative ideology, communism, which was openly against imperialism. The 1926 Imperial Conference created the Balfour Declaration, which should not be confused with the 1917 Declaration on Palestine. This defined Britain and the Dominions as autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status, and in no way subordinate one to another. This evolving relationship was officially established in the 1931 Statute of Westminster. The empire was changing into the Commonwealth, a more relaxed association of increasingly independent nations with the British monarch as its head. Then came the Great Depression, which started with the Wall Street crash of 1929. Economic hardships spread around the world, putting more pressure on the economic ties of the empire. Britain left the gold standard in 1931 and finally abandoned free trade, introducing imperial preference at the 1932 Ottawa Conference. But the economic advantages of the empire were increasingly being questioned. Was it really profitable to keep control over vast territories? Or did the cost of administration and defense now exceed the economic benefits? The historian Edward Thompson argued that the empire had become a burden that they could no longer afford. As if economic problems were not enough, a new danger appeared with the rise of fascism in Europe. Benito Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. Nazi Germany rearmed, annexed Austria, and took apart Czechoslovakia. Imperial Japan expanded in Asia. Britain, still recovering from the last war and dealing with issues throughout its empire, followed a policy of appeasement, trying to prevent another global conflict. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain came back from Munich in 1938, stating he had achieved peace for our time. The peace lasted less than a year. World War II started in September of 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war, and the empire was once again called to fight. This second global conflict tested the empire like never before. The fall of France in 1940 left Britain to stand alone against Nazi Germany. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who took office in May of 1940, rallied the nation and the empire with powerful speeches. He said, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." The empire answered the call. Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African, and Indian soldiers fought in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. Colonial resources once again were sent to support the war effort. But the war also brought unprecedented defeats. Singapore, the supposedly unbreakable fortress that protected Britain's Asian territories, fell to the Japanese in February of 1942. It was the largest surrender in British military history. Japanese forces took over Malaya, Burma, and Hong Kong. In India, the Quit India movement was started in 1942, demanding immediate independence. Although it was suppressed, it showed the growing power of the nationalists. When Britain asked for Indian help against the Japanese forces that had reached India's eastern border. Congress leaders asked why Indians should die for a freedom that they themselves did not have. The Indian nationalist leader, Subhas Chandra Bose, declared that they were determined to have the freedom that was their right, and if the British would not give it to them, they would join their enemies to get it. Bose created the Indian National Army from Indian prisoners of war who were captured by the Japanese. Though it had a small military effect, the war ended with an Allied victory in 1945. But Britain came out of it exhausted and financially ruined. The new superpower rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union left little space for a third major power. And throughout the colonized world, the calls for independence grew even stronger. The process of decolonization started almost right away. In 1947, India and Pakistan became independent, ending 3 centuries of British presence in South Asia. The division of the subcontinent based on religion led to massive movements of people and communal violence that took hundreds of thousands of lives. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, watched the chaos from his residence and supposedly said, "At least we are leaving with dignity." An Indian politician replied, "The only thing leaving with dignity is you, Lord Mountbatten. The rest of us are covered in blood." Burma, now Myanmar, and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, followed in 1948. The British Mandate in Palestine ended in 1948 with the creation of Israel and the First Arab-Israeli War, leaving a legacy of conflict that continues today. In Africa, the pace of change was slower at first, but the pressure increased. The Gold Coast, now Ghana, gained independence in 1957 under Kwame Nkrumah, who said, "We face neither east nor west. We face forward." By the late 1950s, the end was in sight for the entire British Empire. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, speaking to the South African Parliament in 1960, acknowledged the wind of change blowing through this continent, admitting that the era of European colonialism was ending. The process was not always peaceful. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising from 1952 to 1960 was put down with considerable force before independence was granted in 1963. In southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, white settlers declared independence on their own in 1965 rather than accept majority rule, which led to international sanctions and eventually a guerrilla war. In Aden, part of modern Yemen, and in Cyprus, British forces fought against armed rebellions. Malaya, now part of Malaysia, became independent in 1957 after a long communist insurgency was defeated. For the British officials who were managing this dissolution of the empire, it was a mixed experience. Many had spent their whole careers in colonial service, truly believing in their civilizing mission. Now, they saw the flags being lowered and their life's work ending. A retiring colonial officer in Africa wrote in his diary that they arrived with such certainty and were leaving with such doubt. The question shows the ambiguity of the imperial project. Was it about trade, strategic advantage, a civilizing mission, or simply power for its own sake? As the empire fades into history, these questions become more philosophical than practical. In 1976, the British economy was in such a difficult state that the government had to ask for a loan from the International Monetary Fund. It was a humbling time for a nation that once led global finance. The difference from the grandeur of the empire could not have been more clear. A Treasury official noted that they used to lend money to half the world, but now they had to beg for it themselves. The Falklands War of 1982 offered a brief reminder of the imperial conflicts of the past. When Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, one of Britain's few remaining overseas territories, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher sent a naval force to take them back. It was a risky move. The islands are 8,000 miles from Britain, but just 400 miles from Argentina. The logistics were challenging, and the result was not certain. For the British soldiers and Marines who fought in the Falklands, the experience was harsh. The South Atlantic winter brought extreme cold, with temperatures dropping below freezing. Sleet and snow, pushed by strong winds, went through their clothing. The wet ground turned to mud that pulled at their boots and made every step a struggle. A young Royal Marine wrote home that it felt like the end of the world, and maybe it was. Despite the difficulties, British forces managed to recapture the islands after a 10-week conflict. The victory boosted national morale, but it was an exception in the larger story of imperial retreat. In Africa, the last significant colonial territory, southern Rhodesia, where white settlers had declared independence on their own rather than accept black majority rule, finally became independent Zimbabwe in 1980 after years of guerrilla warfare and international pressure. Robert Mugabe, the leader of one of the main liberation movements, became the prime minister and later the president. At the time of independence, he surprised many with a message of reconciliation. He said, "If yesterday I fought you as an enemy, today you have become a friend. If yesterday you hated me, today you cannot avoid the love that binds me to you." The good feelings would not last, as Zimbabwe later fell into authoritarianism and economic collapse. But the moment marked the end of British colonial rule in mainland Africa, a process that started with Ghanaian independence in 1957. The most emotionally charged imperial departure occurred in 1997 with the transfer of Hong Kong to China. Acquired through the Opium Wars in the 19th century, Hong Kong had grown into a prosperous financial hub and a unique mix of British and Chinese cultures. On a rainy night in June of 1997, the last British governor, Chris Patten, held back tears as the Union Jack was lowered for the final time. Prince Charles and the Chinese President Jiang Zemin watched as the flags were changed, and sovereignty was handed over at midnight. For the people of Hong Kong, it was a time of great uncertainty. China had promised to keep the territory's way of life under the one country, two systems principle, but many were doubtful. A Hong Kong businessman observed with a dry wit that the British did not give them democracy until they were leaving, and the Chinese promised to protect freedoms that they themselves did not have. The handover of Hong Kong symbolically represented the end of the British Empire as a major geopolitical force. What was left were 14 British overseas territories, places like Bermuda, Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands, and St. Helena. Most of them are small islands with very small populations. As the actual empire becomes a part of history, Britain deals with its imperial legacy in increasingly complex ways. The Commonwealth, an association of former British colonies and dependencies, changes from an imperial club into a more equal organization focused on shared values and cooperation. The Commonwealth Games, held every 4 years, become a visible sign of these post-imperial connections. Athletes from 72 nations and territories, from India to Tonga, from Canada to Cameroon, compete in a festival of sport that acknowledges a shared history while celebrating unique identities. A Jamaican sprinter told a Scottish competitor at the 2002 Manchester Games that they are family, sometimes dysfunctional, but still family. Within Britain itself, the relationship with the imperial past becomes more complicated. Immigration from former colonies, particularly from South Asia, the Caribbean, and Africa, changes British society, making it more diverse, but also creating tensions and opposition. The Windrush scandal that came to light in 2018 shows these complexities. Caribbean immigrants who came to Britain between 1948 and 1971, who were invited to help rebuild post-war Britain, suddenly faced deportation threats because they did not have the papers to prove their right to stay, even though they had lived in the UK for decades. An elderly Barbadian man said that they wanted their labor then, but they did not want them now. The scandal led to a national conversation about immigration, identity, and the duties owed to people from former colonies. In museums, universities, and public discussions, the imperial past becomes a place for competing interpretations. Some highlight the positive aspects, the development of infrastructure, the spread of the English language and literature, and the establishment of educational and legal systems. Others focus on the exploitation, the racism, the cultural destruction, and the violence that was often used to create and maintain imperial rule. The debate reaches the physical symbols of the empire. Statues of imperial figures like Cecil Rhodes become the center of protests. Should these monuments stay as historical objects, be removed as offensive glorifications of oppression, or be recontextualized with more information about their complex legacies? A British historian argues that we cannot erase history, but we can try to understand it more fully. For the former colonies, the imperial legacy is just as complex. The borders drawn by European powers often with little regard for ethnic, linguistic, or historical realities, remain as international boundaries, creating challenges for national unity and regional stability. The colonial economic systems, designed to extract resources for the benefit of the ruling country, leave behind lasting structural inequalities. The languages imposed by imperial rule, especially English, become both tools of global communication and reminders of cultural dominance. Yet the influence goes both ways. Britain itself has been deeply shaped by its imperial experience. Curry has become a national dish. Words from Hindi, Arabic, and African languages have enriched the English vocabulary. Literature, music, and art reflect multicultural influences. The physical landscape of Britain shows the marks of the empire, from the grand buildings of colonial administrators who returned home, to the collections of global artifacts in museums, from streets named after imperial victories, to monuments that celebrate or now question imperial heroes. A British Nigerian writer reflects that the empire did not just change the world, it changed Britain, too, in ways that we are still discovering. As the 21st century moves forward, Britain looks for a new position in the global order. No longer an imperial power, it navigates relationships with rising nations, some of them former colonies like India, that now have larger economies than their former ruler. The 2016 Brexit referendum, where Britain voted to leave the European Union, is seen by some as a nostalgia for imperial greatness, a desire to be independent again, rather than part of a larger union. Others see it as simply a preference for global, rather than regional connections. Global Britain becomes the post-Brexit slogan, emphasizing ties with Commonwealth countries alongside new trade relationships around the world. It is a reflection of the imperial networks, but now as a relationship among equals rather than a hierarchy of a ruler and the ruled. For the former colonies themselves, the attitudes toward Britain and its imperial legacy vary greatly. Some maintain close cultural, educational, and economic ties. Others have deliberately kept their distance, looking to different models and partners. A Malaysian politician says that they respect their history, but they are writing their own future. The Commonwealth evolves to reflect these changing dynamics. In 2018, Prince Charles succeeds Queen Elizabeth II as the organization's head, not automatically, but by a consensus of the member states. The Commonwealth Charter emphasizes democracy, human rights, tolerance, and sustainable development as shared values, with no mention of past imperial relationships. As the direct experience of the empire fades further into history, its evaluation becomes both more objective and more debated. Historians find new sources, telling the stories of both ordinary people and major figures who were previously ignored. Fiction, film, and other media reimagine imperial experiences from multiple viewpoints. The British Empire, like all human creations, was neither entirely good nor entirely evil. It was a complex system built by people with mixed motives, acting according to the assumptions and values of their times. It brought technological development and educational opportunities to some, and exploitation and cultural disruption to others. It connected distant parts of the world, creating networks of trade, migration, and ideas that continue long after imperial rule has ended. It spread English as a global language, Westminster-style parliamentary systems as a model of governance, and sports like cricket and football as cultural touchstones across continents. But it also imposed foreign rule on peoples who did not choose it. It extracted wealth that benefited mainly the imperial power, and it established racial hierarchies whose psychological effects lasted longer than their formal structures. A contemporary historian writes that the empire was neither the glorious civilizing mission of Victorian mythology, nor the unmitigated evil of its harshest critics. It was human history on a global scale, with all the complexity that that implies. As you lie in your comfortable bed, drifting towards sleep, think about the extraordinary journey we've taken through the rise and fall of the British Empire. From its beginnings in the struggle against Viking invaders, through its expansion across continents, to its peak as a global superpower, and its gradual end, we have witnessed one of history's great stories. We have seen kings and queens, governors and viceroys, soldiers and settlers, missionaries and merchants. But we have also glimpsed the experiences of ordinary people, of farmers and weavers, of sailors and servants, of those who ruled and those who were ruled. The story of the British Empire is, in many ways, the story of our modern world. The international system of nation-states, the global spread of the English language, the borders of countries across Africa and Asia, and the multicultural nature of societies from Canada to Singapore, all carry the mark of this historical force. Understanding this imperial story helps us to make sense of our present world, with its patterns of wealth and poverty, of power and resistance, and of connection and division. It reminds us that current realities have deep historical roots, and that today's decisions will shape tomorrow's possibilities. As sleep approaches, bringing its own kind of empire, the realm of dreams, where the past and the present mix freely, reflect on how history lives within us all. The empires of yesterday have shaped the world we live in, just as today's choices will shape the world of the generations to come. The British Empire has passed into history. Its flags have been lowered, and its anthems have faded. But its legacy remains in the languages that are spoken, the borders that are drawn, the institutions that have been established, and the memories that have been preserved. It is a legacy as complex and as contradictory as humanity itself, a tapestry of achievement and failure, of creation and destruction, and of connection and conflict. And as you finally drift into the empire of sleep, remember that history is never truly finished. The story continues, shaped by all who inherit its consequences, and choose its future directions. The British Empire has ended, but the human story that it was a part of continues, with all its tragedy and triumph, its darkness and its light. Rest now with the weight of history settled comfortably around you, neither too heavy to bear, nor too light to forget. Tomorrow is another day, another page in the ongoing story of human civilization, a story in which we are all, in our own small ways, both subjects and authors. As the gentle tide of slumber begins to pull you away from the shore of wakefulness, let the story of this great empire settle into the quiet library of your mind. The final chapter has been read. The great ships have found their final harbor, and the once vast territories are now independent nations, each writing its own new story. But the echoes of that time remain. They are heard in the words we speak, seen in the lines on our maps, and felt in the connections that still cross the oceans. It was a story of incredible ambition and deep sorrow, of brilliant creation and profound loss. It was a human story, filled with all the light and shadow that our hearts can hold. Now, it is time for all those voices from the past to grow quiet. It is time for the great stage of history to dim its lights, allowing you to find your own quiet peace. Until we meet again, stay cozy, find your peace, and rest well.